Good. Well, and good afternoon. Let's get started. I'm Roger Smith, chair of the DCC program, welcoming you to the last in our 2012-2013 series of faculty workshops on constitution making. This is not the last DCC event of the year. We do have our annual conference, which will be held May 3rd in Houston Hall, and we will have discussions of constitution making in Europe, in Africa, in the Middle East, both Egypt and Iraq. But the conference will be a bit different from our usual format. We will have people who have been participants in constitution making, a journalist, as well as academics. And I think those will be very engaging discussions. But this workshop culminates our series of more academically centered discussions through the year on constitution making, and it is highly appropriate that we are ending with the paper that we have today. Those of you who have been faithful attendees will recall that we began the year with a debate amongst Akil Amar, David Armitage, and David Law about the question of whether the world was rejecting American constitutionalism, the model of the U.S. Constitution, and it's an issue that we've come back to periodically through the year. I think it's fair to say that the argument produced conclusions that while there are certain fundamentals of American constitutionalism, the idea of having a written constitution that structures and limits some kind of representative democracy and secures some kind of rights, this model has been widely influential. Nonetheless, when you look at the specifics of American structures of representative democracy and the content of American constitutional rights, you see wide departures from the American model, even to some degree within the American states, which secure some kinds of social rights the national government does not, and certainly in the representative democratic institutions of countries around the world. Well, for this final workshop, we have a paper that considers the Constitution of the other great superpower of the 20th century, the Soviet Union. And it calls attention to a feature of the Soviet Constitution that is, in many respects, quite fundamental, and yet may perhaps be surprising. Certainly, when I began looking at citizenship laws comparatively, I was quite surprised to find that the Soviet Constitution, which I expected to embody the dictatorship of the proletariat, had the features that Valerie Bunce refers to as ethno-federalism. The Soviet Union was structured as an elaborate hierarchical set of political units, including republics, that were defined in terms of what were said to be their dominant nationality or ethnicity, and Soviet citizens carried internal passports that designated those nationalities and ethnicities defined in terms of their descent, not necessarily in terms of where they currently resided. And so this institutionalized recognition of national and ethnic identities and the organization of political power in light of those identities, this is a feature of the Soviet Constitution that had an impact on the other states that came under the influence of the Soviet Union during the 20th century. This Soviet ethno-federal model of constitutionalism, its impact, and that's why we're fortunate to have its author, Valerie Bunce. She is the Aaron Benencourt Professor of International Studies and Government at Cornell University, where she specializes in comparative politics and also in international relations. Has written on democratization, international democracy promotion, and interethnic cooperation and conflict. Her geographic focus has been primarily East Central Europe, especially the Soviet successor states, though she's also worked on Latin America. She's the co-author recently with Sharon Wolchik of Defeating Authoritarian Leaders in Post-Communist Countries, also the author of Subversive Institutions, The Design and Destruction of Socialism in the State, and many other works. Her discussant, in keeping with our tradition of always getting discussants from other disciplines, is Peter Holquist, who teaches in the history department here at Penn, focusing on the history of Russia and modern Europe. He's the author of Making War, Forging Revolution, Russia's Continuum of Crisis, 1914 to 1921, and the co-editor of several volumes. He's also the founder and now executive editor of the journal Critica, Explorations in Russian and Eurasian History, and the author of many articles. I was glad to learn about this journal because I discovered after inviting Peter that he's actually an old colleague and friend of Val's, as is true of many of us here. But as the editor of Critica, I'm sure you won't lack for critical perspectives. We'll follow our usual procedure. Val will discuss the issues of the paper she wants us to discuss for 20 minutes or so. Peter will comment for 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for all your thoughts. So join me now in welcoming Professor Valerie Bunce.
Thank you. So Roger's just done a nice job of summarizing the paper, so I don't have to. I want to just highlight a few things. First of all, it's been a real pleasure to return to these issues that I dealt with earlier in my career, in which I was interested in the whole question of why the breakup of Yugoslav, Soviet, Czechoslovak states occurred along with the collapse of communism, but none of the other states in the region broke up, despite having minorities. And there was a pretty obvious point here, which is to say those are the three ethno-federal states in the former communist world, whereas the others were not. Let me just highlight a few things in the paper. And one of the things I'd like to highlight, because I feel it's often lost in the discussion, is that the Bolsheviks were incredibly innovative leaders. And the Soviet Union was an experiment. And it did last 73 years, which is longer than China's lasted so far. I always like to point that out as well. So part of their experimentalism was reflected in the structure of the state that they came up with, which is to say this idea that they would have, first of all, it's fairly unusual for dictatorial regimes to have federalism, and secondly, to have ethno-federalism, which they invented, which was a way of having the constituent subunits of the system be based upon and understood to represent and actually invest in specific national communities. So it was not a national federalism as we have in the United States, for example. It wasn't linguistic federalism as you have, for example, in India. And so it was based upon this principle. And there was a huge debate, which I don't go into in the paper, among the Bolsheviks about whether to go in this direction. But they did. What they created was an unbelievably complicated architecture. It wasn't just that they had 15 republics all named after a specific national community. It was also that they had a variety of units within the republics that were nested in, some of which were purely territorial, some of which were ethnic, and a few of which were actually religious in the early years. But I want to emphasize it was complex because, first of all, the Soviet Union is and was a gigantic 1/5 of the world's landmass. So it's a huge amount of thinly populated territory. And that adds to the kind of institutional complexity. But I want to just emphasize the following. Not every nation had a republic in the Soviet Union. Not every nation and not every subunit, in fact, featured the majority of the nation in which it was supposed to represent. Kazakhstan, for example, was more Russian than it was Kazakh. We can come up with many other examples of that. So it was a mosaic, and of course some nations, such as the Tatars, were quite geographically dispersed. As for example, were the Jews, in terms of the early experiments with the Jews, and their having their own subunit. And so you couldn't really have a unit which captured everybody. The Armenian Republic actually came closest to having the highest percentage of the nation upon which the Republic was based. So you want to keep in mind that it did have this incredibly complicated architecture. And another thing to keep in mind is that the Bolsheviks faced a situation. Some nations existed and some were the imagination of the Bolsheviks. Central Asia was in the imagination of the Bolsheviks. The boundaries were truly bizarre, unusual, etc. These were many proto-nations which had not even written alphabets, etc. Other cases, such as obviously the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Estonians, etc. Of course, they joined again. They were part of the Russian Empire, left during the Bolshevik Revolution, and rejoined again after the Second World War. They were developed nations, so one of the things the Bolsheviks faced was that there's incredible unevenness in terms of national identities. So let me just say that in the paper, I also say that the Bolsheviks made this decision. I tend to agree with the very persuasive arguments of Terry Martin on this, but it still is a puzzle to me. So why they decided to go in this direction? Because it had been untried, it was very risky, and really I think that there are several different reasons why they provide rule logic to it. There is recognition. Remember, the Russian Revolution happens when all the empires collapse in that part of the world, in which you have significant nationalist mobilization going on, Habsburg, Ottoman, as well as the Russian Empire. When you have the Wilsonian principles being addressed and discussed in terms of the formation of nations and states. They were listening to that. They almost lost Ukraine. They were aware of what the cost could be of that process. And so divide and rule, perhaps co-optation, a lot of different reasons why they did it. But let me just move quickly, since I'm only trying to do a few highlights, and say, in the short term, they probably got a lot of what they wanted. And I think that that's important to keep in mind. It was a state-building, nation-building exercise that was supposed to structure the system in ways that would serve rapid socioeconomic development. Probably in the short term, that worked. After all, the Bolsheviks stayed in power. The state held, which is really stunning if you think about it, given the chaos of the formation of that state and the fact that it was, of course, an empire out of which the state rose from the embers of that empire. And of course, the Soviet Union was a developmental machine in its early years and amazingly successful. But the argument is that the longer term was very costly, mainly because you build states within the state. These ethno-federal republics did not just have political institutions, they had cultural institutions, scientific institutions, political party. They had everything that essentially constitutes a state. They had economies, they had intellectuals, they had everything. All of it structured on this principle of these subunits. So, obviously when the center weakens, among other things, they're ready to move and become states very quickly. Also, and I don't detail if there's too much, but I know this very well. I'm also a Yugoslav specialist, but I did not. I'd like to introduce myself as someone who works on former states. But at any rate, I didn't talk about this in the Yugoslav case, but the considerable evidence in the Yugoslav case that structure really undermined economic efficiency because of extreme duplication. I don't know if any of you saw this recent article about last few months in New Yorker in Spain. and the economic inefficiencies of Spain due to the autarkies. I was reading about Yugoslavia, I swear, it sounded exactly the same. And so there was an economic issue. But it also was the case that the republics within the Soviet Union, within Yugoslavia, began to assume their own politics and political, economic, and social trajectories. One argument that was made at the time of the Soviet Union collapse, which I found to be quite convincing, is that Russia had to leave or be pulled down by the rest. That it was positioned to move towards a more liberal order in a way that many of the other republics were not. And that it had to free itself to do so. Of course, no one told Putin that, but you know, in the early days, at least in the early years of Russia, that was the case. Okay, I end the paper, and I'll just stop here. I end the paper by taking on the issue which Brendan and I had dealt with before in an earlier time, about, okay, these generalizations about the sort of state regime destroying aspects of ethno-federalism. How well do they travel if the regime is democratic, as opposed to if it's authoritarian? And I essentially argue, I think it travels pretty well. That I think that's at least some of the costs that I identified. Specifically things such as freezing identities. Locking people into a specific identity, which makes them very hard to be anything else, as well as to bargain with one another and engage in collaborative economic, political, or social activities. The ethno-federalism, or we can more broadly say various kinds of association arrangements, are very, very costly in this regard. They're also strongly associated with high levels of corruption. Ethno-political machines develop, this is exactly what happened in the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, where they have a monopoly on the distribution of rents. So over the long haul, this is very costly also, I think, as well for economic performance. So one of the things that I guess I would conclude is that despite the international community's love affair with these kinds of institutional arrangements, for example, after internal wars, I see them as quite problematic. But I can just hear Brendan saying, well, yeah, you know, what if there's no choice? Anyway, there's that element as well. But it is, and Bosnia is testimony to, it is not a state, it's an international colonial project. And it's locked into this extraordinary consociationalism, which has proved frozen any kind of political economic change, as well as collaboration among constituent units. Thank you.
Thank you, Rogers. Thank you, Val. As Rogers pointed out, Val is a scholar whose work I know and appreciate greatly, but is also an old friend and colleague. It's great to see her here. I'm also grateful to DCC for having me at this event. Let me just open by noting that, as Rogers pointed out, I come to this from a different discipline. So there are several caveats in place here. What you're getting with my commentary is not simply or only an appreciation or a criticism of Val's paper, then a dialogue you will have between two disciplines. As a historian, I'm more interested in explaining the particular, why it operates in the way it does, than extrapolating to the general. And in terms of my own interests, I'm especially interested in the historicity of the moment at which Soviet ethno-federalism emerged. For this reason, I'm going to devote less attention to comparative cases that Val treats throughout her paper, the Yugoslav and the Czechoslovak case, and also the more contemporary lessons that she draws in the final 3 pages of her paper, due to simple unfamiliarity by my part with these specific cases. Here I'll refer to Val and to the rest of the room on these questions. Val's argument is that communism began as a creative and a bold experiment. And one of the great experiments of the Soviet state, beginning in the early 1920s, was to build an ethno-federal state in the ashes of the Russian Empire. I think on this point she's entirely right, and it's entirely right to point to the novelty and originality of this model, and also to its great success. In addition to the points that Val has already raised, let me point in a number of other directions. It's often argued that Russia is a loser out of the First World War. It's the first major power that leaves the conflict. It then experiences revolution. Russia is a loser if your standpoint is 1918, 1919. The story looks very, very different if your end point is 1924. And all of a sudden, from 1924, you look back and you discover that the Soviet Union is the only polity that's managed to stitch together the former territory and peoples of a dynastic land empire in a radically different way, but it's the only one that manages to do this. And I think this is a distinctive and very particular achievement. I mean, this is a polity that stretches from the Vistula to the Pacific and from the Arctic down to Central Asia. In addition, there's a tendency to focus on the demise of the Soviet Union. It's one of the great credits, I think, of this paper and Val's work in general, that she addresses how this system operated in practice for so long. Again, if we cast this as, was the USSR a success or a failure as a multi-ethnic communist federation? Now, when I teach Soviet history, my students are inclined to emphasize the end of the story, its collapse, looking for inevitable tensions that are going to lead us to 1991 and virtually every single decade of Soviet history. But consider, this is quite a long-range project that begins in 1917 and ends in 1991, and it's an achievement that's all the more remarkable when placed in comparative context. The Soviet Union existed not only as a vast state over 1/5 of the world's territory, but it existed in what was a very bad neighborhood. I ask you, how many states that originated in 1917 were able to exist as states down through 1991? I can think of 2, I think, but they're almost, it is a highly unusual thing for a state in this particular environment to be able to exist for so long. So it's not only a vast polity, but a remarkably durable one through some very devastating times. Valen points out that this model is extended to other cases of communist ethno-federalism, post-1945 Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. She then notes the paradox that the attraction of this ethno-federal model seems to be the only attractive aspect of this communist experience, has outlived the attraction of other aspects of the Soviet state, but she argues that this is an ironic conclusion because these were precisely the institutions, precisely the model that led to the end of both these regimes and these states. She asked them, why did the Soviet Union embrace this model, and why did Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia emulate it? She suggested the Bolsheviks embraced ethno-federalism for fundamentally 2 reasons. First is due essentially to ideology, that this is a Marxist solution to the question of development. And here I would frankly cite Fran Hirsch's work, Overturned Martins, with her argument for developmental stages. For communists, the ethno-federal state was part of a development project, she says. And the second goal was a more pragmatic or prosaic goal to detooth national communities whose leaders had secessionist agendas and to bind into the state those communities that were still in the imagination of the Bolshevik leaders. There are concrete effects to this particular project. The ethno-federal project fuses the national project with the socialist one, in the sense that it endows these underdeveloped states and peoples with a web of institutions. In her felicitous formulation, ethno-federalism allowed the Bolsheviks to be both good Marxists and clever politicians. Now, the form that this model took concretely was a state that was national in form, that was supranational in form, but with subunits that were national in content, while the citizens inhabiting those states were not necessarily homogenous. And of course, operating behind this whole edifice is the Communist Party. Val, both in the paper and in her comments, has observed that it would be a mistake to assume that there is a convergence, a overlap between the ethnicity of citizens and the existence of those ethno-territorial titular republics. This is something that had been pointed out some time ago by Rogers Brubaker on the development both of territorial and personal nationality in the Soviet Union. That is, the Soviet state did not only divide its territory into ethno-federal units, but also ascribed all of its citizens a ethnic identity, a cultivated individual nationality. And I'm wondering, one of my questions for Val is, can she relate these 2 processes, especially as she underscores the developmental aspect of Soviet ethno-federalism, whether that's also one of the processes that is driving this creation. Again, it's not a recognition of national identity or ethnic identity, but the creation of it Among the differences between the three cases, Val singles out that there were those states in which the dominant republic lacked its own republican institutions, and this is the case of Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union, versus states in which the dominant republic did have its own institutions, and this is Serbia within Yugoslavia. So ethno-federalism was effective, she argues, in the short to medium term. I would, as a historian, ask, it seems to be the long term for the Soviet Union. It takes a very long time for this to finally collapse. But in the long run, it ends up subverting both the state and the regime for reasons that she has described here. She concludes then with a cautionary note, arguing that the ethno-federal model carries many costs and many risks. And here, one other question I have is it's unclear to me in terms of the conclusion whether you mean ethno-federalism in general, in which case we might want to consider more cases, or the communist model of ethno-federalism in particular. I want to move now to my observations as a historian. I put on my historian hat and start parsing and looking for the particular. As you know, historians like to split rather than to lump. My largest question is about intentionality. Bunce's paper describes how communist leaders defined ethno-federalism as a project to accomplish a complex set of goals, that it's a solution to a dilemma that is facing them. It was set up, she says, to serve a set of goals. And as a historian, I simply have to ask, was it all really so intentional? Were the Bolsheviks acting in a vacuum? What is described here the intentions of the framers of this project, or rather a description of how the project actually worked? So I'm going to question the degree of communist intentionality, its purposiveness, its foresight, its voluntarism. Against this, I would note that the date of the formation for these two sets of cases comes at two discrete moments that I think are very distinct and different. One is the Soviet self-creation in 1918 to 1924, and the second is the establishment of these communist ethno-federal states in Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia in the post-1945 era. That is, the origins come at two discrete moments, but the collapse is all at the same time. That is, there's an analytic coherence in the origins, but an analytic and historical convergence in its ending. That is, that there's an unbalanced chronological comparison. I wonder then whether these two sets of cases are analogous. They are structurally and constitutionally, but are they historically so? Second, if this ethno-federal model then was not entirely the product of the tactical and strategic planning of communist leaders, we should then pay attention to the specific conditions and historical arcs into this model beyond the intentions of the framers of this particular model. Can we take into account the factors that were limiting and providing horizons upon which the Bolsheviks were acting? I wonder whether emphasizing Bolshevik and communist intentionality allows us to evacuate the broader context and horizon of possibilities in which the communists were operating. In other words, how do pre-existing institutions and formations limit the options with which the Bolsheviks were moving forward? It would not, I think, surprise you to learn, as a historian, I think the story does not begin with the Bolsheviks. We always like to have permanent regression. Let's unravel this thread and move back. What do I mean by this? I agree with Val that the approach to the political management of cultural diversity was unprecedented. But I agree with this in terms of the actual institutions that were set up. But what of the intellectual and institutional currents which the Bolsheviks were building upon? I'm thinking, first of all, of intellectual precedents, that this is not pulled out of the blue. I'm thinking, for instance, of both the institutions in the Austrian half of the Habsburg monarchy, but also the emergence of Austro-Marxism as a particularly Marxist understanding of how you're going to develop national communities. A second historical precedent and set of institutions on which the Soviet Union will emerge is the crucible of World War I, and particularly not so much Wilsonian self-determination as German imperial self-determination, that is, German occupation policy and the setting up of proxy states. And the third is the impact of the Russian Revolution as a political event, not simply as an opportunity for the Bolsheviks, but as the act which shears off these state formations created by the German imperial project. So ethnofederalism is a Marxist development project. I think you're entirely right on this. And it's for that reason that I want to fold in the question of the individual ethnicities being a factor of this. I wondered then what might be said about Austro-Marxist plans for national development, which to be sure were not realized, but these plans were part of the mental terrain of all European socialists, the Bolsheviks included, not least because they were polemicizing with the Austro-Marxists and Mensheviks. Moreover, the Austro-Marxists were operating within a universe and thinking upon and building forward a set of institutions operating in the Austrian half of the Habsburg monarchy, where there were already, by the turn of the 20th century, some interesting experiments in federal-type institutions. And it's not only the Marxists that were thinking about these problems. It's true that Europe begins the First World War as a continent of empires, and one of the great consequences of the First World War is that it ends the wars as an empire of nation-states, in terms of states and institutions. But in terms of political plans, a good number of smart people before 1914 had given some thought to how you could refashion dynastic land empires so as to incorporate demands for cultural and national autonomy. Most movements at this time, the vast majority of them, did not actually demand independence, but actual cultural or political autonomy or self-rule within an overarching political institution. Two things changed as World War I and the bidding for various communities by the Entente and the Central Powers, but also the Bolshevik Revolution itself, which is the event which causes national movements that had wanted only autonomy to jettison that project and demand independence. Before the First World War, other currents that one might point to as informing at least Bolshevik debates are the constitutional Democrats in Imperial Russia and their models of federalism, which are important intellectually but are also important institutionally. Because the constitutional Democrats actually do rule. They rule for a short time, but they head the state that is in the intermezzo between Imperial Russia and Bolshevik Russia. They head the provisional government, which creates institutions on the ground and acknowledges certain forms of political representation. Or again, another movement from Imperial Russia that is both intellectually interesting but creates institutions, the Mensheviks of Georgia, who created a Georgian state before it is incorporated into the Soviet Union. To broaden this out, I want to stress, and again, forgive me for obsessing about a period that I know, if not love, that is the historicity of this specific moment. I would stress that the Bolsheviks in 1918 and later were not operating in a vacuum, and that they were operating not in a world of their own making, and had to address a number of existing facts already on the ground. They don't embrace ethno-federalism after the Civil War, I would argue, but in the course of that Civil War from the very beginning, because the model is already present on the ground. The one reason the Bolshevik experiment, I think, is so unprecedented is that the situation they were confronting was also so unprecedented. The continent's dynastic empires were imploding and nation states were replacing them. And this was not a natural process. For imperial and great power reasons, the territories that the Russian Empire was losing and confronting were occupied by Imperial Germany, which wanted to dominate Europe and Eastern Europe. But for reasons of domestic politics, Germany could not annex these territories, and it came up with this very original formulation that we will dominate Eastern Europe through a series of proxy states, which they then go about setting up. In other words, the Germans embraced revolutionary means to secure conservative ends, to dominate Eastern Europe, not via annexation, but by setting up a string of nominally independent but de facto client states, all justified on the grounds of national self-determination. In other words, the German Empire was doing much more in terms of national self-determination on the ground than Woodrow Wilson was doing with his speech-making. And it's this, rather than Wilson, that leads to the recognition of Ukraine at Brest-Litovsk. It's in fact the German occupation, that the German negotiators who recognized Ukraine, and then Georgia, and then Armenia, and Azerbaijan. In short, what I'm trying to suggest is that the political formations were not the expression simply of national movements seeking states, but the product of a very specific geopolitical moment. And that situation formates how the young RSFSR, Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, begins formatting its state order. To give you one concrete example, at Brest-Litovsk, the only way the Bolsheviks could stop further German advances, their army had melted away, was to claim to the Germans that they can't advance any further because the Soviets have already established national independent republics. I studied the Don Soviet Republic, and the only reason for setting that up, Lenin says, is to prevent any pretext for the Germans to advance. So there's a dialectic that's going on. Additionally, I wonder, at one point you described the lack of Russian institutions as an attempt to avoid the dominance of Russia within, or an extension of Russian dominance from the imperial era. I would also point out that many of the people building the Soviet state were men from the borderlands, and in this they might be different than the Yugoslav or Czech cases. Stalin, Trotsky, Orджonikidze, Dzerzhinsky, Pol, Frunze, Blucher. To extend this from the Soviet case, I analogously wondered about how the specific post-1945 conjuncture shaped the ethno-federal model for Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. Both of them emerge out of what had not been ethno-federal, but had been complex interwar states. How did their interwar existence as complex states, on which there had been minority rights treaties imposed by the Paris peace conferences, prefigure the post-1945 order? Or again, what I find interesting is why you have ethno-federalism in these two states, when in fact the general model for Soviet domination of these people's democracies is the antithesis of Soviet rule. That is, the Soviet Union keeps ethno-federalism for itself and accepts it for Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, but for the other states of Eastern Europe, it in fact engineers ethnically homogeneous states. There's a good number of Germans and a very good number of Ukrainians in Poland. That is changed after 1946 by population transfers. There is no conception of trying to use an ethno-federal model here, and I'm just interested why for these two cases but not others. And finally, I wonder if the cause of collapse was that communism had provided nations with the tools, Republican-level institutions, for building nation states. How do we then account for the widespread nostalgia for the communist states in these polities, among these societies? I guess what I'm asking in that question is, when you say that communism had provided nations with these tools, what do you mean by nations? Are you speaking here of the political elites? On other questions, such as the desirability of the ethno-federal model going forward, I will defer both to Val and to the room. Thanks very much.
Well, there are a lot of great points there for discussion. If you want to respond to anything.
I don't want to respond to all because I don't want the audience to just sit there passively for too long. I'll just say a couple of things. I guess I don't think Peter and I disagree on anything, although he has much more historical depth than I do. So I'm impressed with the points he's made. I think that yes, there were prior institutions. I'm glad you brought up the Caucasus, because that is interesting, because the Mensheviks win in Georgia, and there's a whole level of disarray, learning, and institutional reconstruction that goes on through the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, there's no doubt about that, and that and that influences very much what is going on. It's also, and I can't do justice to the way historians have worked on this, different strategies in different places. I mean, it looks like such a smooth project, but it's different strategies in different places. I mean, it really is. The Caucasus are not Central Asia. And the way they fell apart is, all this stuff is very, very different. But I wanted to say one comment on the issue of why these three ethnic federations are good. Because the Yugoslav ethnic federation really was not so much, this is interesting, it's not so much a copy of the Soviet Union, although there's an element of that, as it was also learning from the interwar years, the former Yugoslavia, which was a kind of an ethno-federal state during the interwar period. So you had two big ethno-federal experiments going on, actually, in the interwar years. You had the Bolsheviks and you had the Yugoslavs. And so the partisan war in Yugoslavia meant that you could not have a non-federal state. You could not do that because, among other things, Yugoslavia did not demilitarize after the Second World War. If the center tried to establish that kind of power, they would get shot. That's simple as that. And so you had, the nature of the partisan movement was ethno-federal. When you paid off the partisans who won against the war against Hitler, They got republics. There are a lot of different things that went on. It just, partisan wars, by definition, tend to be spatial, right? At the same time, this was an inter-ethnic, inter-religious cooperative venture, the partisan war. And as a result, the structure of the state flows naturally from partisan war, and also to some reason. The Czechoslovak case is only ethno-federal after the Soviet invasion of '68. And that is a very clear Soviet move. To say, we don't want those damn Czechs giving us any more problems. And the Slovaks, who had essentially launched a relatively spirited nationalist movement as Czechoslovakia was moving towards reform communism, basically what the Soviets did is said, we're going to buy your support. We're going to give you institutions, and we'll give you money. And Slovakia cried all the way to the bank after ethno-federalism was formed. And none of my friends who were in Czechoslovakia like this argument. But anyway, I'm quite convinced by it. If you just spend any time there, you can see that the physical plant of Slovakia is essentially dates from '69 on. Whereas the Czech lands look much more like museums of the Industrial Revolution. You see where the investment went. And it wasn't generated within Czechoslovakia. The Soviets subsidized it. So it was a very different, I think, kind of a dynamic. And the question is why not the others? And I think they don't have these these kinds of dynamics in effect. But it comes out of, I think as a story we appreciate it comes out of a different set of processes in both cases. So I just